and welcome to what is hopefully going to be a weekly series going over all of the custom things I made for my ULTRAKILL animation. Which, if you haven't watched it already, I'd highly recommend, as I spent almost 8 months working on it, although 2 months of actual work. Now, I say hopefully, because every time I miss a week I have to pay one of my friends 10 quid, so the stakes are high. In this week's video I'm going to start to talk about the compositing and how I designed this style. Specifically just the base colour for the materials, with the lighting coming in next week's video. There'll be a link in the description to my Gumroad if you want to support me and just outright buy the compositing setup, instead of following all these tutorials and making it for yourself. The style is mostly made in the compositor, so within a few steps I can turn any model and material into the style, whether it be designed for photorealistic renders or for hyperrealism. It works in both Eevee and cycles, although for this animation I used Eevee for the faster render times, and the fact that the real-time compositor has some limitations in cycles, so it doesn't actually work with this style. It's very fast, so you can get a very good frame rate even in the viewport, as long as you turn off some of the extra node groups like smears or depth of field, which I'm going to talk about at some later point in the future. That being said, I'm on a very beefy PC, so your mileage may vary. I'm going to do my best to explain why I'm doing things and how they work, so even if this is your first time seeing this stuff, you should be fine. But some basic knowledge of Blender and the terminology will be helpful. Start off with any object. I'm using this model of the ULTRAKILL rocket launcher, link in the description. But any model will work, especially ones with a proper material and normal map, so don't just use Suzanne with an all white texture, as although it will work, it won't be as cool. To summarise what's going on, in the material, instead of routing the colour into the base colour of a shader node, like a regular shader, we make this white and instead plug the colour into an AOV node called base colour. AOV nodes are incredibly powerful, especially for stylised renders. If you think about how in the compositor you can use outputs like normal, position or depth, AOVs are just a way for you to make custom outputs that go straight to the compositor. So, if we then go into the view layer panel and make an AOV called base colour, same as in the material, I tend to copy and paste to prevent headaches because they need to be exactly the same including cases, so it's just easy to copy and paste. And then go into the compositor, turn on nodes, and then back in the viewport turn it on as well, making sure we're in Eevee. You'll see that there's an output that isn't there normally. If you've got the Node Wrangler add-on, which comes free built into Blender, you just need to turn it on, then you can hover over the circle and press Ctrl-Shift left click to get it to automatically route to the viewer node, which should really be called a preview node, but hey ho. Now we've got the colour of the material without any lighting in the compositor, and we can start to make it stylised. Let's break down the effects so you understand the wider picture, and then build it from the ground up with this knowledge. Now, what kind of things do you think go into making this? I can hear you violently screaming at your screen saying stuff like cell shading, as in colour banding or limiting the brightness to a limited number of values, or line art, but I'm not really hearing that many people saying level of detail. Well done for you. Well done for you guys for recognising that, but if you notice in 2D artwork like paintings or even anime characters when they're not that big on the screen, they aren't drawn in as much detail. Compare that to real life where detail is infinite, or videos where the level of detail is limited by the number of pixels. In 2D artwork, level of detail is limited by how much effort the artist wants to put in, or for our cause, it's smaller than if it would be if it was based on the number of pixels. So, how do we limit the level of detail? Use a blur node, we could use that, but raise your hand next time, and if we do that, then it does reduce the level of detail, but let's be real, you don't need me to explain why this doesn't. Fuck's sake! Fuck. If we do that, then it does reduce the level of detail, but let's be real, you don't need me to explain why this doesn't look good, so we need it to have sharp edges that don't bleed out. Oh, yeah. I heard someone screaming the bilateral blur node, which is similar to the blur node, except it can detect the boundaries and not blur over those boundaries. This certainly does solve the issue, but bright parts tend to bleed, and if we do the patent pending zoom out test, then it just breaks down. You could also try a thing where you dilate the outline around the subject to give it a rounded silhouette, and although it took me way too long to get that working, it really doesn't do the effect we want. We need something that will also smooth out the boundaries and adapt to the level of detail we give it. It was designed in the 1970s in Japan to denoise medical images in heart, and is used nowadays to give a painterly effect that has the exact effect of reducing the level of detail that we want. That's what we need. The Kuwahara filter. Took me an embarrassing amount of time to figure this out, even though I'd watched the Ace Roller video several times beforehand. Great video, would recommend. Now it's so much what we need for this style that it's actually used twice, but watch to the end of the video to find out why. Wink. For my style I use these values, but you can change it to fit your needs, and this applies to any other arbitrary values I put in the video. The size affects the level of detail, sharpness is pretty obvious, eccentricity is a bit hard to explain, but 0 means all the paint strokes are just blobs of all the same size, with higher values stretch and squish the strokes to match the direction of the pixels, which preserves the shape more but doesn't really reduce the detail in the way we want it. And uniformity, weirdly placed, but that basically smooths out the direction of the pixels so it's not as noisy, but then it can also cause some issues if it's too high. Lovely. However, it does get a bit messy when you do the patent pending zoom out test, but we'll come back to that later. Next step is line art. We could use grease pencil or freestyle, but with complex scenes that can quickly slow things down on your PC, and when there's lots of small details and small areas it can get quite crunchy, so let's do this in compositing as well. For this style we're going to go for a kind of a bevel or an edge highlight rather than regular black lines that you would see in like an anime. We're going to be using a method that's inspired by the difference of Gaussians, where you have an input and then you blur it, and then you find the difference between the blurred and the non-blurred version. With the original difference of Gaussians method, you blur both the amounts. Fuck! With the original difference of Gaussians method, you blur both at different amounts, but for the thickness of lines we're going for, it's better not to. Now I found what works best for this are the normals, but other things you can use are depth, or just the image itself to get lines where the colours change. But for some strange idiotic reason, the default normal render output is aliased in Eevee, or in other words the pixels aren't blended together, they're quite jaggedy. This causes some minor issues with how the line art will look. We could use an anti-alias node, but that won't be as accurate, so we can make a new AOV called normal that for some reason isn't aliased in the same way the render output isn't, where multiple samples are done per pixel. We can then use the alpha over node to put the better normals on top of the default ones, so even if we forget to put in the AOV, there will still be some line art. If we plug that into a blur node of size 2 and do the dot product of these, then we can see some signs of an outline, but now I've got to explain the dot product. I'll make this quick. Vector, vector direction and length. Normal vector, always length 1, so ignore length. Dot product is angle between two vectors, if same direction then 1, right angle 0, opposite -1. Okay? So if we map the output of the dot product like this, then we get a measure of how different these two vectors are, which gives us line art. If you're going for a more anime aesthetic, then you can use this as a factor to mix the colour to black, but that's not the style I'm trying to get. We don't really want any line art on the sky, so to fix that we know that there isn't any normal on the sky, so you could say it has a length of 0, and we know normal vectors have a length of 1, so you can just multiply them together. Now you can see some of the light have more effect than others, so to make all of them the same value, we can use a greater than node. Now, if we do the patent pending zoom out test, then you'll notice that it's just all white. This also happens with really detailed objects, and this is an issue that even affects high profile productions. We can fix this by detecting high density areas and making it harder for them to be above the threshold for the greater than node. So it would need to be a very big change in normal to be above the threshold if it was surrounded by other lines. An easy way to do this is with the blur node, and if we map it like this, then we can multiply it with the original lines to get the result we want, where darker pixels will result in less line art. Then make another greater than node with a very small value. Now if we have an object in front of another object, then the line will go over both of them, and since there isn't really a bevel or a corner on the object behind, we don't want it to have any line, so we can detect where the depth drastically increases and remove the line art from those places. I also want these lines to be a tad bit thicker, but if I were to just blur them, I don't want that to go over the same boundaries we just defined, and the bilateral blur node wasn't really doing what I wanted, so I made my own. Since we're going for that bevel look, we want to use the original colour of the base colour, but a bit brighter. So we can multiply it by a number, let's go with 3, and plug it into a mix node with what we made as the factor. And now we have the line art. In next week's video where we're doing the lighting, if you've got an emissive material then you don't really want that to be affected by the lighting. But if we're making the base colour brighter on the bevel, then some of that is going to be brighter than 1, so will be treated as emissive. To prevent this, we separate the brightness and clamp it between 0 and 1, and you can also remove the bevel on emissive parts as I've done here, but that's less important. Next up is limiting the amount of brightnesses to get that step look. There are many ways to describe it: quantizing, cell shading, colour banding, etc. When doing this in the shader editor, every case I've seen people do this is with a colour ramp. That's good and all, but come on, we can do better. What if it's brighter than 1? Well, we can use a snap node and that's better, but we can control it easier if we do 1 divided by a number. But also, darker areas seem to be lacking any detail, and if we like the amount of steps that are in the normal brightness, then we can't just increase the number of steps. Desmos Graphing Calculator! Now, I use this a surprising amount to help visualize what I'm doing. What we've got at the moment is we've got an input X and an output Y, which are basically the same apart from the fact that they're stepped. And to get the same number of steps as in Blender, we can multiply by this and then divide by the same amount. Okay, so we want more detail in the lower end, but all of the steps are the same distance apart. What do you think we can do about this? Fuck! That's right, Felix. We raise our input to 1 over a new variable b. If you ignore the y-axis, this has brought a lot of our steps down to the lower numbers, while keeping values like 1 basically the same. But now our input brightness will look completely wrong, with dark areas being too bright and bright areas looking too dark. So we need to do the inverse of what we did and raise everything to the power of b, squishing it back into a straight line. You'll see that now in the darker areas there's loads more steps than there are in the lighter areas. Back in Blender we can do it like this, where this is our power. Next, group this, because I think you'll be using it again next week. Name it something like quantize and bring the steps and the power out as an input. Combine the colour back together, and let's make all of this a node group called base colour, making all of these things the inputs for the sake of tidiness, and then change the default values of stuff. Going back to what I said about the Kuwahara filter failing the patent pending zoom out test, the reason it does that is because its size is set too big, but for flatter areas where I want to simplify the materials, that's the size that I want, and it's only really the really detailed geometry that causes the issue. If only there was a way to quantify how complex the geometry is. Next, depending on the style or feeling of the shot, you may want to change the bevel intensity. It's currently 3 times brighter than the base colour, but if we want it to be darker, or even black, then for reasons you'll find out in a couple of minutes, the dark lines will become quite thin and barely noticeable. So we can fix that by saying, when the bevel intensity is increasingly negative, the size of the line should increase to compensate. Although this is already looking quite good, it still feels a bit off, doesn't it? The style we're trying to recreate uses thicker lines, so let's make everything a tad bit thicker. A good node for that is the dilator road node, which, if positive, checks to see if any pixels next to it are brighter, and if so, swaps to that one. If negative, then it does the same thing but for the darkest pixel. However, you may have noticed it only takes a grayscale single channel input, when we want it to take a colour. Luckily, we can split colours into 3 separate black and white channels, red, green and blue. Next, do you guys remember that retention trick I tried to pull? When I winked at the camera and said wink and made you all uncomfortable? Well, we're bringing in another Kuwahara filter. This time in a smaller size and an eccentricity of 1. After adding the lineup, we don't really want to turn it into a blocky, painterly look, but keep the boundaries in shape, and that's what eccentricity will do. These two kind of bring everything together, and you'll notice this more as we add more and more effects in the coming weeks, but they just kind of complete the look and hide some of the artifacts made by some of the other node groups. However, there's still runtime in this video, and there's still a couple more things I want to fit in here, so let's speedrun this. The Kuwahara filter can still be a bit blurry if the difference between the colours isn't big enough. So to make the difference bigger for its perspective, we can multiply it all by 1000, and then after the filter, divide by 1000. Even then, past me didn't think it was sharp enough, so I added a diamond sharper node. But if you notice, the boundary between dark and bright areas looks absolutely horrific, and the difference is big enough that you don't really need to sharpen. So we can find the areas where the sharpen does too much and put it back to the original picture. Now, even though you won't notice it, slight gradients make everything look better. Even if it looks like it's just block colours, it will look too flat if it actually is. So to fix that, we add a glare node with these settings. But that's too subtle, and to make a glare node that actually fits the style better, clamp it down to make a threshold, above which we want the glare, do what we did before with the dilate, but make it 20 pixels big, and add in a blur node to reduce the effect of flicker. Then add this to the original. Group it all and make the factor easier to manage by raising it to the power of 3. Then to give it a more cinematic look, let's make a vignette. Get the image coordinates and then the length of those coordinates and then ramp it. We don't really want to happen to the emissive part, so let's do this to fix it. And time! For attention purposes, I'll keep this brief, but thank you all for watching. Tune in next week and the weeks after for more tutorials. See ya!